Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the And God Said podcast. I'm your host, Reverend Kimberly Constant, and this podcast, as many of you know already, is offered in conjunction with a Bible study I teach called Cover to Cover, where we study every single book of the Bible. And if you would like more information, you can find it on my website, www.kimberlyconstantministries.com. I have even a sign-up form there if you would like to receive our weekly newsletter, which has reading plans and discussion questions, as well as the PDFs of these lecture presentations for you. Also, there is an opportunity to join in. I have 2 different online Zoom discussion groups that you would be welcome to join as well. And we are nearing the New Testament, so this would be a great time to join us if you haven't already. You can join at any time, really. We're so happy to have people, so always glad to just fill you in. But if you wanted to start kind of fresh and at a point that makes maybe some good sense, you could start with us in the New Testament and definitely invite others as well. And that will be the first week or so in February where we dive in there. So today we get to cover one of my favorite books in the Old Testament, which is the book of Daniel. This book can be a tough read at first, the first 6 times or so. I think sometimes that you read through it because it's just like, what in the world is going on? But the more I read it, and just when I consider the world that we live in right now, it just feels so timely, so important, and almost fresh again. These words, like they are meant for us as well as the people of Daniel's time. So today we're going to dive in with the first half, and then I'll have a second lecture on the second half because I have enough to say that it makes sense to divide this into 2. So today we're going to look at the first 6 chapters, and I've called this lecture Faith on Fire. So again, in the Setting the Scene lecture, if you weren't able to listen, that's always my kind of primer for us as we begin to study and read through a book. Talked a little bit about dating Daniel's writing somewhere in the very earliest days of the exile to Babylon. So that's where we would situate him in time. So this first portion of Daniel gives us some interesting insight into what life in exile was like. I talked about this again in Setting the Scene, but the Babylonians really attempted to integrate the Jewish people, and in fact integrate them so well, with the idea, I think, behind it being that they would sort of lose their Jewish identity and over, a generation or 2 really become entrenched in Babylon and start to think of themselves as Babylonians rather than Jewish people. And so what Nebuchadnezzar is doing is he's taking this first wave of nobles, the people that had wealth and status in Jerusalem. He takes them off, and the younger people, the young men, he conscripts into service. He wants them to be trained, to be made ready to serve in his palace. Again, hoping that maybe the best and the brightest of the next generation will become entrenched in the ways of Babylonia and will sort of forget their Jewish heritage. So a clue to this is the fact that he renames Daniel and his friends. So Daniel in Hebrew, it means God is my judge, and Nebuchadnezzar changes his name to Belteshazzar, which means Bel's prince, and Bel would have been one of the gods that they worshipped in Babylon. Then we have Hananiah, whose name means beloved by the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar changes his name to Shadrach, which means illumined by the sun god. And we have Mishael, whose name means who is as God, and his name is changed to Meshach, and that means who is like Venus. So you see what he's doing here, this really not even so subtle desire to really change the identities of these young men. And then finally there's Azariah, which means the Lord is my help, and his name is changed to Abed-Nego, which means servant of Nego. So they're all changed names that once reflected the God of Israel, the one true God, our God, are changed to reflect the little g gods of Babylon. In addition to this, we're going to see, or we saw in our reading, that he really tried to integrate these boys, these young men, into the ways of Babylon itself. But we find that Daniel and his friends resist this effort, both in things that might seem small, food, and big, obviously, worshiping the statue of Nebuchadnezzar himself. So, integrating a nation. Like I said, after that first small-ish wave of exile, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the young Israelite men, including Daniel and his friends, to be put through a 3-year training course. And notice who he asks for. He asks for young men that don't have any physical defects, who are handsome, who have aptitude to learn and understand quickly, who have knowledge of Israelite life, and who have the ability to serve the king. So he wants the best and the brightest of Israel, with the hopes that he can turn them into Babylonians. So this is the first wave of assimilation, and he's going to teach them the language, culture, and religion of Babylon. And he treats them very well. He gives them daily food and wine from his very table. So you can imagine, just before exile, things were rough in Jerusalem. And so now they get taken off to this, amazing foreign country surrounded by all sorts of new things. And they're given this delicious food and drink and taken into service for the king and treated very well. You can imagine that without a strong foundation, it would have been very easy to just forget who you were and where you came from, and to just be completely awed by the way you were being treated in Babylon. And as I said, this is in sharp contrast to what happened to the poor northern kingdom of Israel, called Israel. When they were taken into exile by Assyria, most of them were murdered, and the rest, if any, that were left behind were forced to leave behind their Israelite identities. So Daniel fights back against this campaign of assimilation as best he can. And so he refuses the king's food and eats only vegetables and drinks only water. That is interesting, right? I mean, again, just think about how tough that would be, living in the time and place that they did. This gorgeous food and drink, the best you've ever had in your life. And instead you're like, no, I need to remain faithful to God. I'm just going to eat vegetables and water. Like, food is the way to my heart, so I cannot imagine this. And then, interestingly, of course, after 10 days, everyone notes that Daniel and his friends look better than the people who chose to eat with the king. And in response to their faithfulness, God blesses Daniel and his friends and gives them favor. Now, more than Daniel and his friends would have been part of this assimilation campaign, and so presumably there were some Hebrew young men who did go the way of the king and kind of forget who they were. But Daniel and his friends are the example of staying the course. So they were able to learn what they needed to about Babylon. They're able to have this well-placed connection. We think here of the story of Joseph. It kind of reminds us of that, where Joseph was so well-placed within Egypt and won everyone's favor. Well, that is true of Daniel and his friends as well. And they remain true to their faith in, of course, the one true God. And in particular, Daniel is granted the ability to interpret visions and dreams. Also, again, reminding us of Joseph. And it says in the Bible, in every matter of wisdom and understanding, about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. So clearly, God is at work behind the scenes, giving Daniel and his friends favor. So then we have our first crisis, which is Nebuchadnezzar's dream. None of his wise men were able to interpret that dream, and so he sent out a decree to kill all the wise men. And apparently this includes Daniel and his friends. So at this point, they've done enough to be considered wise men themselves. And Daniel and his friends, of course, do the right thing, which is to plead to God for mercy. And God enables Daniel to interpret this dream. Again, we're just so much similar to the story of Joseph here, and even to the story of Esther. You kind of feel those threads coming together in Daniel's story. What is the result? Even Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges God. What is so interesting is Nebuchadnezzar's own faith journey through what happens with Daniel. And so here Nebuchadnezzar says in Daniel chapter 2, verse 47, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries." Now notice he's still saying kind of your God. He's not really assuming this for himself yet, but he's one step closer to acknowledging the one true God of Israel. And what is this dream about? So he dreams about a statue. And if you're able to have access to the PDF, I have a picture of that statue that might make it easier as I'm talking through this. So Nebuchadnezzar is the heart of gold, and after him will come 3 other kingdoms, followed by a final kingdom set up by God. So the kingdoms are Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome, and then the final kingdom. So in fulfillment, this is exactly what happens. 3 kingdoms follow Babylon. Medo-Persia, which we've heard about because we remember the story of Cyrus, the king of Persia, who is the one that issues the edict allowing the Israelites to return home to Jerusalem. Then after Persia, Greece takes over, and then Rome. And the 3rd kingdom, Greece, was said to rule over the whole earth. Imagine me saying that with quotation marks. Obviously, it's not the entire earth, but it was to them in their time. It was everything they knew that existed on the world. His Grecian Empire, Alexander, was the largest of the kingdoms in the dream. And then the future is a Roman Empire. And this speaks both to the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus coming, at the birth of the Messiah, but also to the time of the end, the Antichrist, where it's believed that something like the Roman Empire will be revived under the leadership of the Antichrist. And Jesus will conquer this final iteration of this Roman kingdom. He is, in the dream, the stone that is cut without hands. And then here again, I've got a picture of all that to look at. So the next crisis that comes along is the worship of Nebuchadnezzar himself. So they do earn favor with him, but it's put to the test. When Nebuchadnezzar creates a statue of himself, of course he does, and he ordered everyone to bow to it anytime that they heard music playing. That was the test of faith. But, of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as well as Daniel, did not obey, and this incurs the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar and his officials. And so he orders that, and he issued the edict beforehand, anyone who doesn't bow down, they have to be thrown into the furnace. And so when it's discovered that Shad, Mesh, and Abed aren't doing what they're supposed to, he's like, all right, to the furnace with them. And in response, in Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 18, they say this: King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Those words just give me chills every time I read them. It's just, yes, that's such an example for us. Like, we know the truth. We know who God is. God is able to save us. But even if he doesn't, he's still God. We still worship him. And we are not going to bow down to you just to spare our own lives. Oh, just amazing, right? Amazing. And of course, the best part of the story is God does indeed come to the rescue. So Shad, Mesh, and Abed are thrown into the furnace, and it's so hot that the guards that take them to throw them into the fire are themselves burned up. They don't even go into the furnace. They're just burned up outside of it because it's that hot. And because they're burned up, the three guys like kind of fall in to the fire. But alas, they are unharmed. And when Nebuchadnezzar looks, he says, I thought there was only three of them. Why are there four people walking around? And of course, many, many people believe that that fourth person in the fire was Jesus Christ in his pre-incarnate form. So the result of these men surviving is that Nebuchadnezzar once again praises God. One step closer, but he still isn't quite fully acknowledging who God is. So he says in Daniel chapter 3, verse 29, no other God can save in this way. But he's still not kind of appropriating that for himself yet. He's getting closer, but still not maybe haven't tipped the scales into saying, yeah, I believe in God, but getting closer. So Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. And now, at this point, Daniel has incurred so much favor that he is now the chief magician. And so he interprets this dream for Nebuchadnezzar. And per his interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar himself is the mighty tree that will be cut down. And it's going to happen because he's going to go temporarily insane. And it indeed came to pass. Nebuchadnezzar went crazy. He believed himself to be an animal. He escaped into the wilderness and ate grass and lived in the wilderness as a beast for a while. Interestingly, other annals of history, kind of other historical writings outside of the Bible, note that during this time in his reign, everything went quiet. He didn't write anything. Nothing happened, which makes sense because he's out in the forest thinking that he's a wild animal. So this doesn't last forever. God does bring him back to his senses. And now Nebuchadnezzar not just acknowledges God, he glorifies God, saying this in Daniel chapter 4, verse 37. Everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Ain't that the truth? Go Nebuchadnezzar, finally getting it right. And so perhaps this is Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. I like to think that he actually became a follower of God, and that a lot of this story is not just about Daniel and his friends, but also about Nebuchadnezzar and God's way to win him over. I guess we'll find out one day, right? When we get to heaven, we can ask. But I do feel like he really changed a lot over the course of this story. So the next event that happens a little while later. There's a new king in town. It's the son of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar. So at this point, we assume that Nebuchadnezzar has died. And so he does not seem to have inherited any of his father's faith or even respect for the God of Israel. And so he uses the temple items for his own personal feast. All the gold and the things that would have come from the temple, he brings to his own banquet. So he really has a horrid lack of respect for Israel. And because of this, at his banquet, a hand appears and writes on the wall. And hence we have our modern day phrase, the writing on the wall. So of course, none of his men can interpret this. So his wife suggests to him that there is another, a man who has the spirit of the holy gods in him, Daniel. So this kind of insinuates that not only is Belshazzar really doesn't care at all about Israel or about Israel's God, he doesn't even know who Daniel is or what Daniel is capable of. So the tides had turned a lot for Daniel after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel, and then he, of course, offers a bunch of gifts. Like, I'll give you all these things if you can interpret this for me. And Daniel says, I don't want your gifts, but I'll tell you what it means. He says, God has numbered your days. You have been found wanting, and your kingdom will be divided and given to others. And Bel gives Daniel gifts anyway, and then he is killed in fulfillment of that prophecy. Then we have crisis number 3, the lion's den. So now we have a new king, Darius, who does seem to favor Daniel. And this stirs the jealousy of Darius's other courtiers. And so they decree that no one should be able to pray to a god other than Darius, because they are trying to entrap Darius into having to punish Daniel. Daniel, of course, does not obey this, and he continues to pray to God 3 times a day. And so Darius is forced to throw Daniel in with the lions, although he is hoping against hope that Daniel will somehow be rescued. And he says to him in Daniel chapter 6, verse 16, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." So Darius is hoping that Daniel will not be succumb to the lions. So clearly Darius has heard maybe the story of the fire and that Daniel's friends survived that. Who knows? But anyway, he doesn't seem as bad as Belshazzar was. So Daniel does survive, and he says it's thanks to an angel of the Lord. And so here we wonder, again, is this Jesus in his pre-incarnate form there with Daniel in that lion's den? He shuts the lion's mouth. And so Darius has the men who concocted this plan killed. And he decrees that everyone must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. So another interesting turn of events, although maybe not quite the best way to go about it. To order people to worship God is one step in the wrong direction, perhaps, but it's better than not acknowledging God at all. And Darius says this, "For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth." So it seems that, like Nebuchadnezzar, Darius also comes to have faith in God. So such an interesting part of the story, right? It's that these men who were by all purposes trying to get Israel to forget who they were, instead come to have faith. And the one that doesn't, well, he gets destroyed right away. So that brings us to the end of the first half of Daniel. And the next section of reading and then lecture, we're going to look at Daniel's first person account, his own story and his own record of the visions that God gives him. And again, if you weren't able to listen to Setting the Scene, I suggested there that you might want to listen to that lecture before you start reading, because Daniel's visions can get really confusing, and it might make it easier to listen to the lecture first. Or even if you have time, listen, or maybe just scroll through the PDF real quick, read, and then listen again. Because again, it's difficult material. It's taken me many times of teaching it for it to start to gel in my own head. But it's also interesting and hopefully very enjoyable to read. So I will see you next to talk about the second half of Daniel.